If I told you that a shadowy, secretive organization influences and controls a massive amount of significant events around the world, you might think that I'm crazy. You'd probably think that I'm deranged conspiracy theorist talking about globalists, lizard people, the Illuminati, or the World Economic Forum. But I'm not. What if I told you one organization was behind the 2008 Great Recession, Enron, the opioid crisis, the Valiant price gouging scandal, the murder of Jamal Kasogghi, and the US Enforcement and Immigration's scandal? And honestly, these are just the greatest hits. It's not even close to the full list. But they aren't the CIA, the FBI, the WEF, the Deep State, Big Pharma, or any other nickname or acronym that you can think of. And if you graduated from Harvard, there's a 1 in 20 chance that you either have worked for them in the past, or you do right now. When people say they are controlling the world, they are watching, the people are talking about has a simple, harmless, and boring sounding name. They are McKinsey and Company, and I'm going to tell you all about them.
The sponsor for this video is Private Internet Access VPN, or PIAVPN for short. Now, if you don't know what a VPN is, it basically makes you invisible online, and it stops people from stealing your data. Whether you're online at home or using a mobile device, you're transmitting tons of personal data into the digital ether, which can be viewed by neighbors, your internet service provider, thieves, or worst of all, the government. A VPN is a program which encrypts and hides all that data so people can't see it, or more importantly, they can't steal it. And aside from protecting you from online thieves, it also means that you can access geo-locked streaming content by telling the internet that you're actually in a different country than you really are. So, here in the UK, for example, you can't find Brazilian crime classic City of God on streaming services, but by using PIAVPN, I can tell the site that I'm really in Brazil and agora posso assistir o dia todo. Ótimo, obrigado VPN. PIA is the world's most transparent VPN provider with over 30 million downloads, and is a very secure service. They don't log or collect your data in any way, shape or form, so you're safe at all times. If you don't believe me, they've been audited by world famous auditing firm Deloitte, so it gets their seal of approval as well. Personally, I use PIAVPN because they're the best and most secure VPN at this price point, in my humble opinion. And if you sign up with the link in the description box below and the one that's showing on the screen now, you can save 83% and pay just $2.03 per month and get 4 months for free. It's genuinely an amazing deal. So click the link and sign up, and not only will you get a great deal on a VPN service, but you'll also help out the channel too. Back to the video.
Right about the mid-90s, Disney was struggling and they were looking for ways to increase profits, so they hired a management consultant company to look at their Disneyland theme park for ways to boost the coffers. The company spent a year auditing the park from top to bottom and then presented their findings to then President Michael Eisner. They recommended firing the most experienced 10% of the maintenance workforce, as they were paid the most out of general park staff. They also advised that those maintenance staff that remained should be moved away from day shifts and onto night shifts, and not even regular night shifts either. They also suggested reducing the number of maintenance procedures to avoid paying maintenance workers for repair and replacement work. This would save the park millions of dollars. The maintenance staff that remained protested that the people who had been fired had the most extensive maintenance knowledge of specific rides, and without them, the quality control would likely suffer. They also argued that stopping daily maintenance would lead to more broken or failing parts being left on critical ride structure, and that trying to replace these things once a week in the dark with incomplete knowledge was sure to lead to problems. Their concerns were dismissed, with the management consultants arguing that Disney had an excellent safety record, so they didn't need experts. It was an unnecessary expense. Nobody seemed to realize that it had an excellent safety record because of those measures and experts. The consultants earned millions of dollars in fees, and Disney implemented their advice. A few months later, on Christmas Eve, a guest named Luann Dawson and his family were waiting to board a very tame boat river ride at Disneyland. The ride operator tied the mooring rope for the boat to the dock cleat. The boat, however, was moving too fast and immediately ripped the heavy solid metal cleat out of the wooden docks and flung it at force into the crowd. The cleat partially decapitated Luann and literally caved in his skull as his horrified wife and child screamed at his side. The cleat then smashed into the ride operator's foot, breaking multiple bones. The accident was horrific and completely avoidable. The problem was twofold. The first was that the wooden dock had become rotten from water exposure and should have been replaced, but the staff member who had the knowledge of this type of maintenance had been let go during cost cutting, and nobody else knew about it. The second issue was that the boat was moving too fast to be docked. Standard procedure in this circumstance was to allow the boat to pass the dock first, where the back current would slow it down and drift it back to the dock. The ride operator didn't know this procedure because the staff who would have trained her had been let go during the cost cutting. That accident cost Disney $20 million in compensation to the family. It cost the family their father's life on Christmas Eve, in what is commonly referred to as the happiest place on earth. Not only ruining Disneyland, but ruining Christmas and scarring them for life. The consultants who gave this advice faced no repercussions whatsoever. The consultants were McKinsey and Company. And you might think this story is the earliest and most horrific example of McKinsey's influence, but you'd be wrong on both counts. The Second World War was coming to an end, and life all around the world was very slowly starting to return to normal. Following its conclusion, the United Auto Workers Union in Detroit asked for a salary which better reflected the brutal amount of hours that they had undertaken during the war. They were also asking for pension plans and healthcare plans to be part of their employment package. Ford and Chrysler refused and gave workers a choice: wages or healthcare and pension, but not all three. UAW threatened strike action, and to avoid it, Ford agreed a small wage increase and a funded pension plan for workers who had served 30 years or more. UAW then approached Chrysler expecting them to offer the same. They didn't. The workers went on strike for 100 days and cost Chrysler $1 billion in lost sales. Chrysler then gave in and accepted the same terms as Ford. That left only GM remaining. Being wary of paying the same price as Chrysler, GM offered better terms of a fully funded pension plan for everyone and wage increases which would be pegged to the cost of living. Meaning, when the cost of living increased, so did the salaries. It also negotiated a guaranteed minimum annual vacation for workers. In return, UAW gave up the right to collectively bargain for employees for a specified period of time, and agreed to not engage in strike action for a period of no fewer than 5 years. The deal was referred to as the Treaty of Detroit and largely seen as a win for all parties. The framework was copied by other industries to avoid the same problems, and it led to many former working class people joining the middle class due to their increased spending power. And this actually led to an increased automotive sales and an increase in US homeowners too. Turns out the majority of car buyers and homeowners are average Joes, and when average Joe has more money, average Joe spends it on the goods and services of various companies. It was a rising tide scenario. one of the first examples of trickle-up economics, which is the idea that when the general populace, average Joes, have more money, it leads to wealthy people becoming even more wealthy, because average Joe tends to spend rather than save, and when average Joe spends, it's often on the same consumer goods and services that wealthy people created to acquire their wealth. Fast forward 10 years or so, and GM asked the consultant group to conduct a study. The simple question that they wanted answered was this: are executives paid enough? That group was McKinsey and Company. McKinsey and Company was founded by a professor of accounting, James McKinsey, in 1926. He pioneered the use of accounting principles in organizing management structures to make companies more efficient. What does that mean? Fucked if I know. I've read it about 20 times for this video, and I still don't know what it means. McKinsey himself died in 1937 from pneumonia, but his successor, Marvin Bower, had been well trained and groomed. The company was pretty successful and grew very quickly. Bower also came up with the idea of structuring McKinsey as a corporation whose stock was held exclusively by McKinsey executives, a reward structure which is now the worldwide industry standard for executives. And as you'll see, that's largely because of McKinsey. In 1951, McKinsey were asked by GM to analyze executive salaries. If you can't see the subtext here, then let's make it obvious. The CEO of GM wanted to be paid more, and he hired McKinsey to justify that pay increase. McKinsey assigned a chap called Arch Patton to conduct the analysis. For context, at the time, executive pay was on average 20 times higher than the non-executive average. Patton surveyed 37 different companies and came back with a surprising, though not really, result. Worker pay had been rising faster than executive pay. Of course it was! Worker pay had been suppressed first by the Great Depression and then by war conditions for a long fucking time. And they just won their first pay rise in about 2 decades. Harvard Business Review and Fortune magazine published the study, and for the first time, executives across multiple industries could see how their own pay measured up to the competition. This led to a rapid and massive wage price inflation spiral as executives scrambled to negotiate better pay than their competitors. People often use this phrase, wage price inflation spiral or wage cost push inflation spiral, to argue against minimum wage increases. The argument is that when people are paid more, businesses simply charge more once they know that your spending power is increased. Or that higher wages to workers means price increases because the company is then adapting to try and keep their profits. They're never ever using it to argue against executive pay increases, despite the fact that it's far more likely to lead to inflation at executive level due to the fact that the figures being discussed are significantly larger. They're always trying to prevent the lowest earners from earning more money. In fact, numerous studies show that minimum wage increases have almost no effect on inflation. One particular longitudinal study of restaurant price inflation found that for every 10% that minimum wages were increased, it caused only 0.36% inflation on prices. Minimum wage increases just don't cause inflation, or at least it's not significant enough for anyone to care about. Multiple companies then hired McKinsey to restructure executive pay, and this led to McKinsey's already rising profile to go national. Today, executive pay is 351 times greater than the average non-executive worker salary. This also led to another huge change in business. Because executive pay was now tied to stock performance, the general attitude was that the health and prosperity of a company was now going to be measured by stock performance instead of production goals or income. Now, production goals and income can be a measure of company health and can improve stock performance, but there are much easier, quicker, and shadier ways to improve stock performance, as you'll see.
Well, I can't dunk.
No, but you can cook.
What are you talking about?
Your resume says that you minored in French culinary arts. Most students, they're working the fryer at KFC, but you bust tables at Il Picador to support yourself. And then you get out of college, and you come and you work here. How much did they first pay you to give up on your dreams?
This is the excellent movie Up in the Air, starring George Clooney and a woman who I'm unashamedly in love with, Anna Kendrick. The movie tells the story of a business management consultant whose sole job it is to fly all over America firing people because their bosses want to fire people and they don't want to get criticism for firing people. I know, ridiculous premise, right? But in truth, the movie is much closer to a documentary than a piece of fiction, as far as that premise goes. Today, the word offshoring means something different than it did in the 1950s. Today, it's the word used to describe hiding wealth from taxes. McKinsey didn't invent offshoring, that was economist Ronald Coase. What McKinsey did do, however, was recontextualize it in the wake of the union's victories in the publishing of the executive compensation study. Most CEOs had hired McKinsey to restructure their executive pay and now receive bonuses based on stock performance. The problem was it was kind of difficult to increase stock performance because of the agreements made with the unions, which meant that they couldn't make labor any cheaper. They couldn't fire anybody either. So the only way to increase production and hopefully profits was to invest and expand, which takes too long. When you've got your eye on that third super yacht, you want those bonuses today, damn it. You don't want to wait 5 years for it to pay off. By the time the 1970s came around and the recently deceased Jimmy Carter had begun the process of freeing up private industry from the evils of government regulation, the attitude in business had swapped from steady long-term growth and planning to a much more explosive boom or bust mentality. It wasn't quite the greed era yet, but it was getting there. It was during that period that a particular practice became an extremely common measure of immediately boosting profits. A practice which became and still is synonymous with McKinsey. You might say they're experts in it.
Is I don't have any actual experience of management consulting, so
Fire 30% of the workforce. New logo. Boom. Out. You are now a fully trained management consultant.
McKinsey knew another way to increase profits, and that was to cut costs. The first and pretty much only cost that they ever advised cutting were staff salaries. Like with the Disney story, their aim was to chop out the most experienced members of non-executive staff to save money on salaries. Now, the people in those positions were often people who had started at the bottom and worked their way into it. You know, working class people who had busted their ass to make their way into the middle class by joining management. McKinsey didn't care. It wasn't their staff that were being chopped, so why would they care? And the company didn't care because they were going to be given a short-term boost to profits, which would increase the share price and unlock those juicy bonuses. So, throughout the 80s, they went from one company to another, recommending cutting 10% of the workforce, a practice which McKinsey themselves were known for, as each year they cut 10% of their own staff as a method of motivating the ones who remained. This was McKinsey's specialty number one. Their second specialty was solving a problem that they just created. With less workforce, how could these companies possibly function? Offshoring, or as we know it now, outsourcing. When CEOs went back to McKinsey to ask them to fix the businesses which were now struggling due to understaffing, which McKinsey created, McKinsey advised that due to technological improvements, these positions based around management, numbers, data, accounting, could be done anywhere. So they told companies to rehire the positions, but overseas instead. They recommended India. The difference in currency and the fact that labor cost in general was much cheaper in India was financially advantageous. And the fact that India was colonized by Britain meant that most people who they would need to hire would likely speak English and likely have had a Western standard education as well. Firing the managers in America and rehiring them in India became common company advice. This was a roaring success and saved tons of money. Before long, McKinsey realized this didn't have to be restricted to just outsourcing the lowest rungs of management. They started recommending closing entire factories and shifting the entire production overseas. And this ended up being extremely popular advice, as it not only saved massive amounts of money from using a cheaper labor force, those countries have less rigorous regulations enabling them to finesse things the way they wanted to, which increased the company profits and unlocked those juicy, juicy bonuses. I think it's only fair to say at this point that the obvious benefit of doing all of this is that goods became massively cheaper to the American consumers. Most of the things you can afford today, TVs, video games, stereos, cars, electronic devices, cameras, is because someone in a much poorer country gets paid a lot less than you to make those goods. But it's not entirely bad for them either, because while the wages are much smaller than a US wage, it's often much higher than the national average of that country, and can sometimes lead to economic growth for them too. China's a powerhouse today because it spent about 20 years being the manufacturer for everyone in the world. But for the American worker, you guys means losing your job. The reality is that it's not immigrants coming from another country to steal your job. Employers abandoned American workers to take your job to immigrants. In 1984, South Africa was forming the first democratic government. Apartheid had ended a few years earlier, and our friends at McKinsey were looking to dip their toes into national affairs. Up until this point, they largely avoided government work as it comes with greatly increased scrutiny and oversight, something they learned after they were accused of under-the-table dealing in New York when working for the government in the 1970s. They were, allegedly. Since the government in South Africa was pretty new, McKinsey incorrectly assumed it would be easier. South Africa was rife with corruption at the time, and many well-placed private individuals were siphoning public money into their own pockets. One politician was even quoted as saying that he did not join the struggle to be poor, as he received a $10 million payout of taxpayer money. To counter this issue, a collection of rules and regulations had been created to both increase opportunity for post-apartheid black individuals and stem the corruption. Fast forward to 2005, and McKinsey figured it was safe to enter the ring and became advisor to a company called Transnet, which was the state-owned railway. At this time, 3 immigrant brothers from India had become very influential in South African government. They were called the Gupta brothers. The Gupta brothers had been using a variety of front companies to drain public funds into their own and President Zuma's accounts, and made him and them very wealthy. McKinsey assigned a dude called David Fine to the job of overseeing the Transnet business. As a South African himself, he knew the landscape. Almost immediately after taking charge, Transnet decided to reinstall a guy called Siyabonga Gama as rail chief, a man who had been fired previously for suspicious and corrupt behaviour, a decision which prompted board members of Transnet to quit, because they were never consulted about bringing back a guy that they'd just fired. A few months earlier, a newspaper owned by the Gupta brothers had reported that Gama would be installed as the new chief, giving people a clue as to how it happened. McKinsey were asked to assess the possible economic future activity to prepare the rail network for it. Transnet decided, on the basis of McKinsey's extremely optimistic forecast, that they needed to buy 1,000 new trains. McKinsey put a $2.6 billion valuation on the contracts, and they were put out for bidding. For no reason at all, Transnet suddenly decided to impose a strict and sudden deadline right before the bids were about to be reviewed. McKinsey, in a rare and probably the only moment of ethical clarity they've ever had, decided that this felt suspicious and removed themselves from the project. The following day, the winning bid was announced, and it was $1 billion more than previously negotiated. Many suspected that the guy who had previously been fired for suspicious and corruption behavior might have been responsible for the sudden increase because he was maybe secretly directing the money into the Gupta brothers' accounts. Maybe. He was. While McKinsey had stepped aside from that particular can of worms, it didn't leave South Africa, and the new Transnet deal was massively overpriced. Thanks to McKinsey. The government decided that they needed to trim some of the fat on this deal, so in a classic McKinsey double play, they were hired to solve the problem that they literally just created. Now, around this time, some parties who worked at McKinsey's South African branches started asking questions about suspicious behavior surrounding those contracts for Transnet. During the stealthy investigation, it was revealed that senior partner Vikas Sagar, years earlier, had asked a colleague to help him write someone else's MBA thesis. A strange and ethically questionable request already, given that's technically academic cheating. Or might even be fraud, I'm not even sure. The person who the thesis belonged to was an MBA student named Bonga Gamma. The same guy who was later suspiciously appointed Transnet chief behind its board's back. Now the issue was that given that Gamma then went on to become the chief of a company which awarded millions of dollars of contracts to McKinsey, it was technically a bribe and needed to be reported to the US government. They did, but no action was taken after McKinsey pinky promised that they didn't do anything wrong, and the government said, "No problem, we totally trust you." Vikas was a very influential person within the Joburg office. As a senior partner, he also had a lot of autonomy as well. He had a reputation for dealing only one-on-one with clients and excluding everyone else, including McKinsey members. But he was a revenue generator, so his behavior was often overlooked. Vikas would be put in charge of a rather large project to fix the state-owned power company called Eskom. The contract was worth about $700 million, potentially. But Eskom was a bag of problems. South Africa regularly had power outages caused by workers striking because of very poor and unsafe working conditions. Inside the McKinsey Johannesburg office, about half of the office thought that it was a fool's task, which the company should definitely avoid. McKinsey didn't, they just took the job against those concerns anyway. McKinsey's contract was somewhat unusual. It was one in which they didn't actually know how much money they were going to get paid until the job was completed, and would receive nothing until the job was finished. It was like gambling. McKinsey steamed ahead without having the contract approved by the National Treasury, just assuming it was fine. Like I said, they didn't really do their research.
This technically meant that they were an unlicensed government operator, which was against the law.
They also dumped Regiment's capital and partnered up with another subcontractor called Trillion. Like before, they didn't bother to conduct a check to see if Trillion was free from undesirable individuals and black-owned. Both were legal requirements. Trillion was selected by Vikas and was actually a spin-off of Regiment's Capital, the company that they said was too corrupt to work with. It was also part owned by a man called Salim Essa, a close friend of the Gupta brothers. David Fine wasn't on the Eskom team led by Vikas, but as a straight and narrow kind of guy, he was watching it carefully and had noted that Vikas had been having private meetings with Trillion and Eskom officials on a regular basis. When Fine approached Vikas about this, he became defensive and accused Fine of not trusting him enough.
Which is the very first sign that you definitely shouldn't trust someone, because an honest person just answers the question. They don't get all indignant and make you feel guilty about asking the question.
Fine, as any reasonable person does, went away from the deal, wanting to know who owned Trillion. A question nobody had even bothered to ask yet, despite the fact that the answer might break the law.
Thinking on it, maybe that's the reason nobody asked it.
Fine discovered that the man controlling Trillion was Salim Essa and would not pass the government test of undesirable individuals because of his ties to the Gupta brothers.
Also, I don't think that it's unfair to say that he fails there must be a black South African part of the law.
Vikas insisted that he never had any meetings with Essa.
Definitely lying.
The reason he was so insistent on working solo with the client was to hide who he was talking to. He also regularly wiped his computer, but was eventually undone when letters bearing a McKinsey logo citing a contract between Vikas and Salim Essa were uncovered. McKinsey then cut ties with Trillion and informed Eskom, but Eskom fired him anyway because they'd been suspicious of contract irregularities for a few months. When the South African government then began an investigation, McKinsey claimed to have never worked with Trillion as an official partner, but the aforementioned letter contract proved otherwise.
This reminds me of the time when my auntie caught my brother with lipstick all over his face when he was younger, and she went to him and asked him, "Have you been using my lipstick?" And he just innocently shook his head.
McKinsey were in trouble. They were now being accused by media and the Chief of Justice of enabling and profiting from corruption. Their usual tactic is to just stay silent. But they couldn't do that this time, so they sent David Fine to apologize on their behalf. Luckily, Fine had a great reputation, precisely because he always followed the rules. McKinsey then tossed Vickers as the sacrificial lamb, claiming that he'd acted alone and was a maverick, a lone gunman, and they had no knowledge of it. Later, McKinsey were found to have been awarded 2 more contracts which were questionable. One, Transnet contract, in which a former partner, Regiments, had diverted millions of dollars to the Gupta brothers, and an airline contracts that they acquired through bribery. McKinsey, realizing that they were on the hook for bribery, improper acquisition of government contracts, improper vetting of partners, destruction of official records, finally gave up and agreed to refund all the money that they had earned, about $100 million or so. Nobody went to jail, and nobody really heard about this till now. So, if you're anything like me, and since you've committed to watching hour or 2, I don't even know how long this video is going to be, but you've committed to watching a documentary about a dodgy business, you probably are just like me. Then you might be wondering at this point how nobody at the top of McKinsey knew just how bad it was getting in South Africa. How did they not know all the illegal activities that were going on? People in the Joburg office knew, and they'd raised suspicions, so why didn't the CEO know until it was way too late? There's 2 answers, the first of which is so tempting to subscribe to, and that is that he did know, and he just didn't care. But actually the real answer is that the company is structured in a way that it's unlikely that he would know, and that's completely intentional. McKinsey, and I imagine a lot of other corporations, kind of functions like a terrorist cell. That's not to say that they torture people or blow stuff up. It's that terrorist cells are structured in a particular way to make them harder to break. So for example, you'd have the head honcho who was in charge of everything and the final authority. And then underneath him, there'd be a few minions who each had their own thing going on, which nobody knew about except for them and their minions. Now this would mean that if people from cell number 1 were captured, no amounts of torture could reveal information about the other cells because they didn't know. It never leads to a disruption of organization because these are all zealots aiming for the same indoctrinated cause, some ideological goal. So it's easy for the leader to trust that the individual cells will do what they're supposed to do because they're basically brainwashed into the same belief system. Over the years, the McKinsey values have changed a few times. It was originally a list of about 19 values, which nobody seems to have a record of anymore, and people can only really recall like bits and pieces here and there. This was then shortened to 9 values, and then 5, and then expanded to 7, which is what I took from the company handbook for this video. 2 of those values, maintain client confidence and maintain independent perspective, were part of the original list, but has disappeared or been replaced by less definitive sounding versions over time. Those principles, however, create the foundation for the entire corporate attitude towards work at McKinsey. McKinsey takes such a hardline stance to maintaining client confidence that it will never ever reveal a client or directly reveal their work with a client. This protecting of sensitive client information is the shield behind which McKinsey hides its shady businesses from even its own employees by having highly compartmentalized offices and teams, just like terrorist cells. Went a long way around, but we got there. And just like terrorist cells, it works because everyone at McKinsey is drinking from the same Kool-Aid. Above all else, make money. Maintaining an independent perspective is probably the second most important principle for McKinsey. This principle is the one which McKinsey hides behind whenever they're hired to do something immoral or unethical, and it also enables them to basically be a double agent for competing interests. You'll see. They claim to not be ideologically involved in any way, and is simply serving a valid client. They're just following orders. And if that sounds like a very similar to an excuse given by a collection of admittedly very sharply dressed but very ethically questionable militaristic political party members in the 1940s, it pretty much is the same excuse. Their statement's always, we do execution, we don't do policy.
They're sending people that have lots of problems.
¿De dónde son ustedes? ¿Y tú?
And they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
The children are inconsolable, repeatedly pleading for their parents.
They're rapists.
It's 2018, and the news networks are flooded with videos of detained migrant children crying at the border as a result of the then President Trump's border control policies. This aggressive attitude towards migrants really wasn't helped by the president's comments about migrants. The pleas and tears of the parentless children drew attention to a situation which was previously barely discussed: the conditions of the migrant separation camps and the company who helped to create them. For full disclosure, let's start by saying Trump did not hire McKinsey specifically. Obama did that a year earlier, but Obama did hire McKinsey for about $20 million, and their job at the time was to streamline the application process so that immigration applications could be processed more quickly and they could get off the books. A year later, when Trump took office, he changed McKinsey's task, and suddenly the task was to do a McKinsey specialty: cost cutting. This time, however, they couldn't recommend staff cuts because Trump had pledged thousands of immigration officers to control the border. They did the analysis that was asked of them and presented their recommendations. Number 1, give detainees less food and lower quality food, stating that ICE food standards were too high.
What? They said the immigration and border control food standards are too high?
Number 2, limit medical attention and supplies. Number 3, reduce guard staff at facilities. Now, these were the headlines, but the details sound even worse. They also suggested moving detainees to smaller facilities in local sheriff jails. Now, these jails were very run down and completely unfit to house even prisoners, never mind migrant children. To give an example of one of those facilities, one was in Dilley, Texas, which was a sheriff jail which technically was approved to hold detainees, and at one point held 16 children under the age of 2 years old, all separated from their mothers and fathers, in jail. In March 2018, Marie Juarez was being housed at Dilley and contracted a respiratory infection and died shortly after being released from the facility. She was 2 years old. Her mother filed a wrongful death lawsuit and was awarded $60 million in compensation after it was revealed medicine was denied at the facility, which was one of McKinsey's recommendations. And the only action that was taken by staff was to put Vicks VapoRub on the child's chest.
Imagine being 2 years old, living in a rundown jail cell with limited and low quality food. You don't know where your mum is and you're very, very sick and you're struggling to breathe. And the heartless fucks who put you there don't give you antibiotics to make you better. They give you Vicks fucking VapoRub. And then they watch as you slowly drown in your own bodily fluids.
At the time, the contract for housing, feeding and taking care of the migrants, including children, was held by a company called Core Civic.
Wait, why is that name familiar? The oldest private prison contractor in the US is a company called Core Civic, which were formerly called Corrections Corporation of America. Ever notice how these horrible companies have really benign sounding names all the time?
Anyway, Core Civic held the contract and obviously objected to McKinsey's ideas of giving detainees less and lower quality food and less medical care, as did the people inside ICE as well.
Can you imagine how fucked up your advice has to be when a private prison and a ruthless border agency says that your measures are too harsh?
In 2018, when Trump enacted the zero tolerance policy, things got even worse. Prior to that, detainees had been held in shitty conditions, but they were held together. In an attempt to terrify families into not even bothering to cross the border, anyone illegally crossing was held in criminal detention, which meant that they would be separated from whatever children they had with them. and those children would be housed in the same conditions which McKinsey had helped to create. Children as young as 2 years old, in a strange foreign land whose language they didn't understand, eating low-quality food, lacking medical care, sleeping in jerry-rigged jail cells.
Even if you really hate immigrants, like hate them with your entire soul, with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, surely you can't advocate for that. Unless you're truly without any level of conscience or empathy. Because to me this is utterly abhorrent and it makes me really fucking angry. And it did for some of the McKinsey staff too.
Up until this point, McKinsey's work there had been in the background, but a New York Times article suddenly gave it national attention, and McKinsey staff, who had only joined because McKinsey had given them a make a real difference pitch in their interviews, were shocked and disgusted to learn that they were part of the company creating this event.
One of those staffers tells a story about how his best friend called him at work one day to tell him that he was being deported because his parents were overstayers and ICE had come to arrest him. He thought the guy was joking and hung up. Then when he tried to call him back later, he was already gone.
The sudden shock to the staff was because the work with ICE was completely kept in secret thanks to their discretion policies and the organizational structure. But now that they knew, many of them were protesting about McKinsey's involvement. They held meetings to demand McKinsey resign from the contract and sent mass emails. They also agreed to give back money paid to them by McKinsey for work that ended up being connected to the ICE project. For weeks, these protests and mass emails swept through the offices. Management responded by sending their own mass email, stating, "Do you know how much money in lost productivity those emails caused? The people who had dissented were invited to seek external growth opportunities," which is McKinsey speak for, "Please fuck off." Previously, McKinsey had obligation to dissent as one of its core principles. After this incident, the handbook was amended to say, maintain a duty to speak up. And if you read between the lines in the handbook, it looks like they're saying speak up against unethical actions the company takes, but what they really mean is, speak up when the client has bad ideas.
We're down 1.7% here, a loss of 37 points or so. Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
In 2008, a bunch of people whose only job in life is to make money. A group of people who repeatedly boast about how good they are at making money. A group of people who claim to be so good at making money that they don't need regulations, lost so much money that it literally fucked up the entire world for a decade. Maybe more.
Just to give you some tangible effects of that in my life, prior to the economic crash, wages were increasing in the UK. Pretty much all jobs offered annual pay rises, sick pay, and even shitty entry-level call center job that I was working at the time gave annual bonuses at Christmas as well. Today, all of those things are gone. Companies use the crisis to strip away all those things for the vast majority of people, and they never came back. If I went and acquired the exact same job today, I wouldn't be offered any of those things that I had back in 2007, and the salary is often just the legal minimum.
And that's pretty tame by comparison to the millions of people who lost jobs, homes, and their lives because of that small group of people whose sole job it is to make money. But all of those guys still received millions in bonuses and still kept their jobs, and governments around the world used your money to pay all the debts that they had racked up. It's easy to see why so many people still hate and scorn bankers today, nearly 2 decades later. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that McKinsey caused this problem. This was caused by a lot of different people, but McKinsey did teach everyone how to do it and influenced policy to allow it. Back in the 1970s, McKinsey ran around teaching all the various banks in the world how to restructure their companies to take advantage of the new financial products created by banker Louis Ranieri. Now, if you want a good intro, crash course if you will, into how the economic crisis happened, go watch The Big Short. It gives a really good, entertaining crash course into the issue. If I try and teach you now, your eyes are going to glaze over like you just took a hit from the world's biggest bong. In short, Ranieri made it so that nobody was responsible for the creation of bad mortgage loans. Banks then started offering massive bonuses to mortgage brokers to write as many mortgages as possible. And those brokers targeted ninja clients. That's not people trained in ninjutsu, it's people with no income, no job or assets. And wrote them predatory mortgages they knew the customer couldn't afford, but they didn't care because those bad mortgages that definitely weren't going to get paid were sold as financial products on the open market to other people and listed as safe investments by corrupt rating agencies. What McKinsey did was decentralize banking structures after writing different articles and papers criticizing banking regulation, which led to its deregulation. This allowed low-level bankers and mortgage brokers to act independently, giving loans and mortgages to everyone without any oversight by anyone. They then encouraged the banks to offer big bonuses for the issue of those mortgages. More mortgages sold means more increase in stock price, which, thanks to McKinsey's work in the 60s, meant higher executive bonuses.
If you'd like a loan, applying for it can be as easy as picking up the phone. Just call Continental Illinois at 1-800-841-8000 for a loan application. And do it right now, while there's a stupid commercial on.
Continental Illinois is an equal opportunity lender to qualified borrowers.
Chicago's Continental Bank had been around since the Great Depression days and, along with other banks, had been snoozing every day since. McKinsey popped in, gave them a new corporate structure framework, which has such a cliched buzzword name, I had to check it was true. Matrix management. That framework had done pretty well at a previous client, Citibank, a few years earlier. Within a few years of implementing this advice, Continental was suddenly doing much more business, and by 1981, it was the biggest industrial lender in the United States. The stock price shot up, as did the executive pay. The problem was that the new structure, which removed accountability and gave greater leeway for employees to act independently, had allowed a banker to write $1 billion of bad loans in the energy sector. And when the economy dipped in the late 80s, Continental had a problem. And people knew it. And so depositors suddenly withdrew $10 billion from their accounts, fearing that it was about to go bankrupt. This became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and eventually it did become insolvent, eventually receiving a massive multi-billion-dollar bailout from the government, courtesy of the taxpayer. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history, until Enron. It's amazing just how many times proponents of smaller government and less socialism suddenly come running to Uncle Sam for a handout when it's their money, which has just been eviscerated. See, they're not really against socialism. They're just against you receiving socialism. In reality, they think it's great. The cause of this? A man called John Little, who had been receiving kickbacks for writing these bad loans and got away with it because of the new corporate structure, which allowed him to work independently. Fun fact, the term too big to fail was invented because of this incident, engineered by McKinsey. As the 80s rolled in and the Gipper took office and started forcing capitalism to smoke massive amounts of crystal meth and setting fire to huge piles of banking regulations, which allowed banks to invest money that they didn't have and also invest depositor money, something they hadn't been allowed to do since before the Great Depression, as it was one of the primary causes of the Great Depression. McKinsey couldn't have asked for a better president, and he was followed up by Bill Clinton, who was even better. McKinsey hired a consultant named Lowell Bryan to head up a new banking department. Bryan brought with him an idea which would become pivotal: securitization. He saw the work that Louis Ranieri had done with mortgages and realized that you could do the same thing with all types of loans, not just mortgages. Student loans, car loans, credit card debt, medical debt, you name it. You could put them all together and then sell bits and pieces of it just like they did with mortgages. Brian and two other colleagues began writing books about securitization of all debt in an attempt to make the idea more attractive. They even wrote a journal article which would be cited by the Federal Reserve, and this helped to influence policy and opinion on the idea of securitization and gave it legitimacy. In 1980, when the idea began to take shape, the market for securitized assets was about $100 million. By 1991, it was $1 trillion. $1 trillion of bad loans, credit cards, auto financing, medical debt, mortgages. In 2007, right before the crash, that number was 27 trillion, or twice the GDP of the United States. It was in January of 2007 that Michael Bloomberg and Senator Chuck Schumer presented a McKinsey study, which warned that New York was about to be taken over by London as the world's financial capital because there was too much regulation, and it was strangling the economy.
Imagine seriously making the argument that London has less regulations than the USA. It's one of the most heavily regulated markets in the world.
Just a few months later, in August of 2007, financial Armageddon began.
So almost everything there completely wiped out. And the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
The Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them.
676 points down.
On the subject of financial Armageddon caused by McKinsey, if you don't know who Enron is, then I can only assume that you must be younger than a Backstreet Boy, because back in the early 2000s, Enron was a meme before memes even existed.
I believe the only venue for me is the Ride of Broken Dreams.
Oh, you mean the Enron ride? Let's go.
We're all gonna be rich!
We broke even.
Now, there is a genuinely excellent documentary about Enron called Enron, Smartest Guys in the Room, in which they explain perfectly how the execs who gutted Enron and bankrupted a billion-dollar company, wiping out personal savings of thousands of employees, did what they did. So I won't go into the same level of detail as other incidents. I'll just recommend you watch the documentary on Amazon. It genuinely is really good. But wait a second, just exactly who were those executives who created the biggest bankruptcy since Continental Bank?
These three fucking ball bags, Andy Fastow, Ken Lay, and Jeff Skilling, are the deep-fried chicken nuggets who fucked it all up. Back before Enron was Enron, it was a simple natural gas and oil supplier company headed by Ken Lay, who was the CEO at the time. Lay was no stranger to unusual practices himself, as under his stewardship, they had a habit of hiding losses in a second set of secret investment companies. While Lay wasn't directly overseeing the traders and division where this happened, when investigators uncovered this, rather than firing them, Lay sent them a telex asking them to keep making us millions of dollars. It was an early sign that Enron and Lay weren't averse to taking risks and breaking laws. When Lay became the CEO of the newly formed Enron, he moved the headquarters to Texas, where he lived and where his two best pals lived, George H.W. Bush and his son, George W. Bush. In fact, he was such close friends with the two that he helped them in their election campaigns. But even before the Bushes, Lay was deep into politics and was a very, very big reason why energy markets became deregulated in the first place. But it was his disciple, Jeff Skilling, who really turbocharged everything. Skilling came into the company and immediately restructured it in a very compartmentalized fashion. He gave greater freedom to the people lower down the ladder, he gave them autonomy. He also immediately introduced a managerial procedure which was nicknamed Rankum and Yankum, in which employees would rank each other every year and the bottom 10% would be fired. That sounds kind of familiar.
But his big idea was to securitize energy markets in the same way Ranieri did with mortgages, in the same way that Brian had pushed for with other household credit. If these all sound like something McKinsey would have done, well, that's because Jeff Skilling's previous employer was McKinsey.
Look at how shocked I am.
Under Skilling's leadership, Enron expanded and built power plants all over the world, most notably in India. Enron and their partners committed to building about $20 billion worth of power plants in India, in agreement with the Indian government that they would pay 90% of it. However, in 1996, when the ruling party were voted out, the new guys decided it was too expensive and just stopped construction, leaving Enron with a $1 billion loss on their books. Skilling brought in Andy Fastel, who continued the proud Enron tradition of hiding losses in secret offshore companies. But you can't hide losses forever. They needed to generate some profits to cover the losses. Luckily, Republican governor of California in 1996, backed by a Republican Senate and lobbied by Enron and its executives, deregulated California's energy markets, and Enron, over time, thanks to that deregulation, came to be the biggest power provider for the state of California. They were the power supplier in an unregulated market in which they were also trading power for profit. And that's a fucking problem.
It started at noon, rolling across the state. Sacramento, San Francisco, Beverly Hills, Long Beach, San Diego.
26,000 miles of California power lines, enough to circle the earth. But for the second day in a row, not enough electricity for America's largest state and the world's sixth largest economy.
When the rolling blackout started in California, there was definitely a lot of excitement in the air. It was something new. It was something that hadn't been encountered before. It was, how is this event going to affect the price of power?
Democratic Governor Gray Davis had capped the price of energy to keep the cost to consumer low. In response, Enron caused blackouts.
That's right. Those famous rolling blackouts of the mid to late 90s in California had nothing to do with Democratic mismanagement. It was Enron.
Enron traders regularly purchased power at the lower capped price in state and then transferred it out of state and sold it at higher prices. As a result, the energy which should have powered California was sent out of state. Now, if that sounds shady, well, you're wrong. It's not shady. It's absolutely illegal. But nobody found this out until way later, when secret taped conversations of the Enron traders on the trading floor were uncovered. And it really didn't make for good listening.
So we fucking export like a motherfucker. You're getting rich. Trying to...
We know all of the California imports. We know all of the California load.
We're getting pretty spoiled on with this money. You said you were getting a little scared. We're making a little too much, and I tend to agree with you.
These are two traders, Traders. This is what they say. What we did was overbook the transmission line we had the rights on and said to California utilities, if you want to use the line, pay us. By the time they agreed to meet our price, rolling blackouts had already hit California, and the price for electricity went through the roof.
Hey, this is David up at Enron. There's not much demand for power at all, and if we shut it down, could you bring it back up in 3 or 4 hours?
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you just go ahead and shut her down then, if that's okay?
Okay.
I want you guys to get a little creative.
Okay.
And come up with a reason to go down.
Like a forced outage type thing.
Right.
Those guys, at the flip of a switch, could just yank the California economy on its leash whenever they wanted to, and they did it, and they did it, and they did it, and they made so much money.
There would be ample supply available at the right fucking price.
Oh, sure there would.
It wasn't just Enron. Every company traded according to the rules that California put up there.
And we're the future of Enron. And we're fucking making $500 million for Enron. Can you believe that? Yeah. We'll definitely retire by we're 30. What's happening? There's a fire under the core line. It's been derated from 45 to 2100. Burn, baby, burn. That's a beautiful thing.
California's electric utilities may have to pull the plug on millions of customers.
It's the fucking coolest thing I've done in a long time.
Yeah. Holy fuck, yeah.
You gotta love the West.
Oh. During the height of Wednesday's blackout, fire crews had to free people trapped in elevators.
Oh, that's why you guys stole from those poor grandmothers of California?
Yeah, Grandma Millie, man. But she's the one who couldn't figure out how to fucking vote on the butterfly ballot.
Now she wants her fucking money back for all the power you charged right up her ass.
It's kind of hard to say, well, we should be, we shouldn't do this even though it's allowed because, that's what we do.
Right. The best that could happen is fucking an earthquake, let that thing float out to the Pacific and put them in fucking candles.
I'm going to get the $9 billion back that Enron, Dynergy, and Reliant stole from us and get it back to you.
Davis was fighting a losing battle. The state regulator was Republican. The Senate was Republican, and Enron was a massive donor to the Republican Party. The chairman of Enron was best friends with the Republican president and the former Republican president. Midway through the crisis, future Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger even used the opportunity to score points against Davis during campaigning by placing the blame entirely on him.
Gray Davis has terminated opportunities, and now it's time we terminate Gray Davis.
While secretly meeting with Enron's Ken Lay at the same time to try and kill an investigation into their shady practices. But California was eventually saved, and power prices and generation went to normal when Skilling and Enron realized just how wrong and unethical they were behaving. Just kidding. Everything went completely to normal right after Enron went bankrupt and had no control over the market anymore. But even Enron's bankruptcy wasn't normal either. You see, Lay, Skilling and Fastow had all cashed in the stock options which they had prevented their employees from selling, netting a few $100 million each in the process. They sold when the stock was at an all-time high, and it was at an all-time high because the market didn't know about the $72 billion in losses that the company was hiding in secret shell companies. Fastow, Skilling and Lay did, which made their stock sale insider trading. For the average working class people who worked at Enron, they had been encouraged by Enron to put their life savings, their kids' college funds, their bonuses, their health plans, everything in Enron stock. When the stock tanked, they lost their jobs, their houses, everything. Some people even lost their lives. Jeff Skilling made $174 million. Ken Lay made $659 million. Ken Lay died of heart failure before his trial. The $600 million was never recovered, his wife claimed.
What happened to all that money? It's gone. It's gone. There's nothing left.
Sure it was. Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in jail and a $40 million fine. McKinsey, who were paid $10 million per year for 10 years by Enron in consulting fees, were not prosecuted. Remember back in 2020 when this happened?
Thanks for staying with us. A SARS-like virus
has died in hospital in the northern city of Lille.
COVID-19.
Well, the United Kingdom is now on total lockdown.
At the start of the pandemic, the UK decided to create an app so that when people took a COVID test, their results would appear on the app, and it would immediately tell the person to either isolate so they don't infect anyone else, or that they were fine. They could continue as normal. Normally, this kind of thing would be done via the National Health Service app. It's a government app that literally everyone who's registered with a GP in the UK already has access to. But instead, the Government Department for Test and Trace, headed by a lady called Dido Harding, opted to create an entirely new app, completely separate from the NHS app. This would obviously be more expensive, as it would be brand new. It would also be more difficult, and perhaps, maybe might not have been the best choice when faced with a rapidly expanding pandemic.
Generally speaking, the track and trace COVID response was disastrous in the UK. The UK employs thousands of NHS admin workers who had local knowledge of patients and could have been used to contact patients or update records. It already had public contracts with suppliers for things like PPE, which could have just been ramped up to supply medical staff with what they needed and alleviate the strain on hospitals and their staff. But instead of simply increasing existing contracts and services which had already been vetted, Harding, a member of the Conservative Party, handed out massive government contracts to unvetted, brand new companies which were owned by Conservative Party donors or Conservative Party members. Normally in the UK, government contracts go through a vetting process, one, to ensure the applicant is suitable, and two, to ensure the applicant can actually do what they say they can do, and that the best price has been achieved via competitive bidding. During COVID, the Conservative government created a secret VIP lane in which none of those checks happened. We had faulty COVID test kits provided by a company called Randox, which employed Tory MP Owen Paterson as a consultant. We had a currency trading offshore finance company
awarded £252 million to manufacture and deliver medical-grade masks, which were mostly faulty and unusable. A company called P14 Medical was given 2 contracts worth £140 million to manufacture and deliver PPE, and just imported substandard PPE from China, which was unusable. Its director was Tory councillor Steve Deschamps, I don't know how you say his name. And Test and Trace awarded a £410 million contract to a company called Serco, who had twice been fined by the UK Serious Fraud Office for shady practices. They hired a collection of untrained, zero-hours contract workers to carry out their procedures, rather than skilled, trained and experienced workers. The chief of Serco was the brother of Tory MP Nicholas Soames. The Test and Trace app itself failed to notify 25% of patients that they had tested positive for COVID and needed to isolate. The app was designed to decrease and control the spread of the virus by keeping people informed. The virus at the time had an R0 number of 0.3, which meant that every patient infected 0.3 more people. After the app was created, that number was 0.7. Only weeks before this fiasco, a management consulting company was asked to assess the Test and Trace app and rated it as excellent. They were paid $1 million for that work. That company? McKinsey. But why would McKinsey be involved in British medical care? Maybe it's because Dido Harding's former employer was McKinsey. Is this a lot of information? Are your eyes starting to glaze over? You're feeling bored? I don't blame you. It's a long story and it's mostly business related, which isn't exactly hookers and guns. Well, I'm sure there were a lot of hookers for these guys, but none here on this channel. So let's take a chance here to make a coffee, or if you're British like me, then a cup of tea, and have a quick break. Hi, welcome back. So far, McKinsey has been instrumental in the deregulation of financial markets leading to the Great Recession of 2008, the shocking treatment of migrant children during a border crisis, the California blackouts, the 2 biggest corporate bankruptcies in American history, the rampant culture of downsizing for executive bonus gain, the infection and death of thousands of British COVID patients, in addition to the siphoning of £37 billion of public taxpayer money into private companies, which was later branded illegal by the courts, and the bribing of South African officials to gain hundreds of millions of dollars of consulting fees. While all of that sounds really bad, it still isn't the worst thing which McKinsey has ever done. Prior to 1980, doctors were extremely resistant to prescribing any opioid-based painkillers for anything less than severe pain. Doctors were scared of repeating past mistakes. In 1880, opioid addiction started to become a major problem. Medicine was light years behind where it is today. Aspirin hadn't even been discovered yet. For pain, there was only really one option: morphine, which had been discovered by Bayer in 1804. It had started to become very widely used due to the fact that it was, and still is, the gold standard for pain relief. During the American Civil War, it's reported 400,000 soldiers developed what they called soldier's disease. Today, we call it morphine addiction. As a result of its widespread and uncontrolled use, this happened. In 1914, the government restricted its use to prescription only, which is why the graph suddenly dips again, but the problem still persisted, but they were actually aware of it now at least. That's when Bayer, they came up with a wonderful new drug to cure people of morphine addiction: heroin. I know. Wild, right? That at some point in history, we were led to believe that heroin cured people of morphine addiction. I guess it kind of did. Just gave you a heroin addiction instead. It was marketed and sold by Bayer as a cure for everything. They told people to use it for a cough, a headache, the common cold. They even advertised it as children's medicine. As you can imagine, use rates, addiction rates, and death rates all started to increase. Interesting side note, heroin was barely used by the USA prior to 1919, But then when Bayer lost the trademark rights to the drug after Germany lost the Second World War, suddenly it spiked in the USA because now American pharma companies were the ones profiting from it. After the 1940s, governments collectively cracked down pretty hard on heroin. As a result, usage dropped dramatically. There were also numerous national and international public awareness campaigns of just how dangerous and addictive the drug was. Use rates increased again following the Vietnam War because, just like before, a lot of soldiers came back addicted, but its use did decline again for a pretty long time, as people were aware of just how terrible and awful both it and morphine really were. Then in 1980, one small, tiny, really, letter was misappropriated and misrepresented as a full scientific study. Purdue Pharma used this to justify and legitimize the use of their drug OxyContin, a drug which is twice as potent as morphine for mild and moderate pain. They essentially told people they could use it for headaches, tooth pain, stub toes, when you stretch a little bit too far sometimes and tweak your back, or when that annoying work colleague won't go away. Pretty much anything. Now, if you want to know the ins and outs of how and why this happened, I strongly recommend watching the series Dope Sick. It's super interesting dramatization of the actual events and covers it extremely well. There's also a book too if you don't want to watch the series. It deals with how Purdue developed the drug, marketed it, and how they got it past regulators too. What you won't see in that show, or any other show or documentary about this topic, is how McKinsey are involved. But don't worry, I'm going to tell you. McKinsey came on board at Purdue in 2004, but actually their involvement in the opioid epidemic actually came about 5 years before, when they were hired by Johnson & Johnson, the people who make baby products, who were trying to improve the sales of their fentanyl-based painkiller patch, Duragesic. McKinsey advised them to target high-abuse patients and encourage doctors who were prescribing less potent opioids into prescribing fentanyl patches instead. They literally told them to advise doctors who were giving people cocodamol to swap it for fentanyl instead. And I wish I could illustrate just how fucking crazy that really is. It's like giving someone crystal meth as a caffeine replacement. This eventually led J&J to be tried by the state for influencing a health crisis with misleading marketing around the drug. They eventually agreed to pay $5 billion to settle the case. McKinsey received no punishment of any kind, and were only tenuously linked to the case years later by news media. Their advice to Purdue was even more psychotic. Purdue was already under investigation at the time when McKinsey came aboard, and were predicting choppy waters. Initially, McKinsey were hired to contain the public fallout of parent groups who were protesting against the use of OxyContin after their kids had died from it. McKinsey's advice was simple. Use existing OxyContin users and addicts and pay them to participate in promotional material to say how helpful and safe the drug is. Another piece of advice they offered was to create a sales contest for the sales workforce to increase how aggressively they would pursue doctors to stock the medication and increase sales. It was very successful. Finally, Purdue agreed with the FDA to reformulate the medicine to make it less abusable. McKinsey workshopped the FDA proposal with them to guarantee that it would pass. And it did. How did they know this? You'll see soon enough. Over time, the issue became more and more public. Pharmacies refused to stock OxyContin at any dosage level because they were experiencing too many break-ins from people trying to steal the drug. As sales started to plummet, Purdue again turned to McKinsey. Their recommendations this time was to offer pharmacies rebates for both addictions and overdoses to encourage them to continue stocking the drug. $6,000 per patient for addictions and $14,000 for overdose deaths. Just in case you're wondering, that is the dollar value per person that McKinsey attached as an incentive to pharmacies for hooking people with opioids and killing them. They advised to offer better incentives for the doctors most likely to prescribe, creating or exacerbating pill mill doctors. And in the case of actual doctors who didn't want to get people hooked on opioids and had started to ban the pharma reps from their offices, those reps were told to seek out prescribing nurses instead. And since they were paid a lot less than doctors, they were deemed to be more likely to prescribe and more vulnerable to sales tactics. The biggest supplier of prescriptions was Walgreens, who unfortunately had got into some trouble after admitting that they broke the law by not monitoring prescriptions properly, and so had begun to tighten them up. So they tried to convince Walgreens to allow direct mail order prescriptions to patients in need. This insane idea is going to come back again later in another story, which would bypass some of the monitoring methods that had been recently enacted as a result of the problem that Walgreens had. McKinsey ensured Purdue that this would turbocharge their sales. A week after making these recommendations to Purdue and a couple of other pharma companies, McKinsey were awarded a $2.6 million contract to advise the FDA, the regulator for prescription medicines, including, but not limited to, OxyContin. The contract was to develop new management structure for the FDA. It essentially gave them access to the people whom could make Purdue's life easier or harder. They were playing both sides. Actually, they were playing three sides. Because one thing I left out that is in this chart, the example that they use for the rebate scenario is CVS. CVS is another of McKinsey's biggest customers. They were advising one client to pay incentives to another, and then advising a third client on how to stop the first two clients. Now, I don't know if Purdue were aware that McKinsey was getting paid to work against them. But I'm guessing probably not, since McKinsey tends to keep their client lists really super duper secret. McKinsey, when later investigated, tried to claim that they weren't aware of the problems of this advice and were simply doing what they were contracted to do. Execution, not policy, remember. This was made a laughably blatant lie, however, when an email leaked to the president of North American Pharmaceutical Operations at McKinsey, Martin Elling, stated that they should start destroying records in case anybody started coming looking. 600,000 people have died as a result of those turbocharged sales. Those turbocharged sales created tens of millions of opiate addicts, who after oxy was restricted, turned to heroin, fentanyl. Those turbocharged sales led to a 25% increase in violent crime across the board. And those turbocharged sales would eventually force Purdue, but not the Sacklers who owned it, to declare bankruptcy due to the massive class action lawsuits they were facing. It earned McKinsey $84 million in consultation fees over 10 years, though eventually they did have to pay out $640 million to settle claims from a variety of different US states for their parts in the crisis, while simultaneously protesting publicly that they didn't do anything wrong. Wait, you didn't think they were just going to leave it at that, did you? No. Not want to miss out on an opportunity, McKinsey executed the classic McKinsey double play and found themselves getting paid to consult in various different groups to help opiate addicts and treatment centers. They were getting paid to help clean up the mess that they had created and also being paid to make. Valiant was like many other pharma companies. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D to develop new and interesting drugs and then sell them on to the consumer. The drug, ribavirin, or ribavirin, I don't know how you say it, which is now the standard treatment for Hep C, is one of those drugs. It was doing pretty well. Not amazing, but pretty good. Then the CEO was accused of multiple sexual harassments and had to step down. The stock price at the time was $13.24. Not too long after that, Valiant appointed a man named Michael Pearson as CEO. Pearson immediately came in with a particular strategy. He restructured executive pay so that it was tied to stock performance rather than being a fixed salary. It also had huge bonuses if the stock hit specific targets before certain time points. If it didn't, the bonuses were lost. So there was a very strong motivation to increase stock price at all costs. and fast. Pearson immediately decentralized the company from top down, giving each department its autonomy and freedom to act with greater authority. He then cut 10% of the workforce. I'll give you 20 guesses who his previous employer was. Yeah, of course it was McKinsey. Pearson brought with him Robert Rossellio as CFO, who had also been part of the team which had advised Purdue Pharma. Within 7 years, the stock price had gone from $13 a share to $252 per share, an incredible run, which encouraged billionaire investor Bill Ackman to invest $4 billion in the company. Now, on the one hand, this could have been because of hard work, savvy business decisions, and solid determination and work ethic. Or, yeah, of course it wasn't. The thing is, rich people are desperate for us to believe that they're just smarter than we are, and that's how they got rich. When in reality, it often involves shady behavior and not getting caught. The way Pearson did it was to just keep buying more and more companies. In those 7 years since he took over, Valeant acquired over 100 companies, spending $30 billion of money that it didn't have. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the company was cash poor, so it used tons of debt raised via corporate loans to buy companies, and then it took all those corporate loans and squished them together into one securitized asset. McKinsey really loves doing this. And then sold portions of it. So portions of that massive pile of shaky debt to investors to raise more cash. Now, when I say investors, I don't mean people like Elon Musk or other billionaires, people for whom losing money is pretty inconsequential because they're so unbelievably rich. They sold it mostly to things like public pension funds, so if that debt went unpaid, it would be average Joes who lost their money. Not the banks who issued the loan, or the company which took the loan, which is the exact same problem which led to the 2008 financial crisis. So how did they pump the price so high? Simple. They targeted companies who had monopoly drugs, and that's a drug which holds a market monopoly, and get that price more jacked than Hugh Jackman for a new exercise video called Getting Jacked with Jackman. Hugh, if you steal that title, at least give me credit for it. Or to put it more bluntly, price gouging. They were price gouging. Like with the drug Cyprine, which is used to treat Wilson's disease, which went from an already eye-watering $650 a month to $21,000 per month. I know, right? They would acquire these companies, fire the entire research and development teams, and then increase the price of its flagship drug by a minimum of 400% each time. It's vulture capitalism at its absolute worst, but that's not everything either. They also bought a company called Philidor, which was a specialty mail-order prescription service, and the purpose of these types of mail-order prescription services is to store and dispense medication which has complex storage requirements, or for serious conditions, things like rheumatoid arthritis or cancer medication. But Valeant used Philidor to dispense incredibly expensive versions of its own non-critical drugs instead. Things like, life-saving stuff like toenail fungus cream or acne medication. When insurance companies noticed that these super expensive yet non-critical drugs were being filled by Philidor, they just started rejecting the prescriptions, rightly assuming that they were bullshit. I don't know if anyone is aware, but one thing insurance companies hate doing is paying for absolutely fucking anything. At this point, Valeant was already engaging in price gouging, forgery of doctors' prescriptions, and medical insurance fraud. Why not throw a few more crimes to the list? So they created tons of fake small mom and pop sounding pharmacies and started filling the same overpriced shit medications via those, fake pharmacies instead. They only got caught because short sellers, who for years had said that the stock was overpriced, stumbled onto these prescriptions and realized that these pharmacies were named after Stephen King novels and were probably not genuine.
In Delaware, 70 different pharmacies were registered by the same lawyer. My staff member's going down them and says, "Isn't that a character from The Shining?"
When this information started to get out, in addition to the disgusting price gouging, Valeant stock went from $252 to $70, losing $70 billion of investors' money in the process. Bill Ackman had been insisting Valeant was the real deal the whole time.
The bottom line for us is we are very confident both in the management, in Mike Pearson and the larger team, and the board of directors.
And he took a $2.8 billion L on this investment. Pearson gained $182 million in executive compensation. He was made to pay $750,000 in fines. While McKinsey wasn't directly involved this time, both the CEO and the CFO had been long-serving McKinsey reps. Pearson was there for 26 years before moving to Valeant. It is not unfair to say, at the very, very least, McKinsey doesn't correct this type of behavior. Most likely, they actively encourage it.
Google search has become a lot worse than you think. Look at this. Let's say, how to secure my data. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 adverts. These are all sponsored links. Like, imagine if you clicked on one of our YouTube videos and I chose to start with 4 sponsored ads before I even...
Back in October of 2024, YouTuber Mr. Who's the Boss made this video about Google search and how it was not just incompetent, but he felt that it was intentionally bad to guide people to sponsored results instead of organic results. Google gained its dominant market share of search engines by doing one thing better than everyone else: search query results. They made sure that they were the most accurate and the fastest, to the point where we don't even call it searching anymore, we call it Googling. That's how much they dominated. The focus at the time was delivering a better user experience than every other company. In contrast, Yahoo focused on delivering ads in order to earn more money. Which is why some of you all listening right now are saying, what the fuck is Yahoo? Google used to boast about how quick your search result was on the actual search page itself. Today, they don't. In the past, Google did numerous things to distinguish ads from organic results. Sometimes they were in a highlighted yellow box, other times they were in a specific ad box to the right of searches, sometimes they're in a carousel, and now the only difference between a sponsored search and an organic one is this.
The sponsored search results look exactly like the genuine search results, apart from a tiny little, much less obvious sponsored text.
I've had similar issues with both Google and YouTube. A massive part of my job here is looking for information to fact check things which I might say in the video. It's by far the longest stage of my video making process, but I'd say about a third of that fact checking time is spent trying to figure out which question to ask the search engine to give me what I'm looking for. And it returns a lot of incorrect searches. So much so that over the last, 6 months or so, I've been using Russian search engine Yandex about the same amount of times as Google. And I've found it's getting me to my target information more often than Google does and with fewer searches. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that at some point in the past, Google changed their algorithms. In the past, it would bring up sites and information which closely matched the actual search term that you were using. But today, it returns results that it thinks you're looking for based on your search history. This change was made to stop people gaming the system by stuffing keywords into every blank space of the page, as Mr. Who's the Boss shows here. Now, the problem with that is, if you do what I do, your search history is so wild and varied that it can't really be used to predict what you might be looking for. When your search history contains everything from how to speak Vietnamese and PC building to murderers and corporate fraud, how can it possibly know what I'm trying to search for based on my history? During the making of this video, go watch it, it's awesome, I was looking for the crash report for when Larry's plane went down. I knew it had to exist somewhere, but I didn't know where to find it. I spent 3 days Google searching this with numerous different search terms, and I actually never got the answer, so I just assumed it didn't exist. It did exist, and I found it months later on the NTSA website after a conversation with a friend about pilot's licenses. Google never got me to that query, but it did take me to a lot of newspaper reports about his crash and death, because that's what it thinks I'm looking for. Also, it increases the chances of seeing an ad if Google sends me to a loosely related news report where it can show ads for travel or news subscriptions than if it sends me directly to the report itself, which you can't really advertise anything on a report. The plane definitely did crash and everybody definitely did die. It was a shitty old plane piloted by an idiot who was not certified to fly it, just in case you're wondering. I'd recommend watching Mr. Who's the Boss's video on this particular aspect of bad searches if you're interested, and I'll link it below. What Mr. Who's the Boss was so close to realizing but didn't quite get there is that he was right. It is intentional, and there is a reason. At the end of his video, he kind of lets Google off the hook really and says the reason they don't fix it is because actually, you know, it's so difficult managing these kind of things. Whether he did this on purpose or not, it doesn't really matter. He's wrong. Google did this entirely intentionally. What is the answer to 99 questions out of 100? Money. From 1999 until 2020, a guy called Ben Gomez was in charge of making sure Google search was the best possible service that it could be. Ben focused on making sure accurate search queries were returned quickly and didn't even really consider how much money was made doing it. Actually, it wasn't really possible because of one of the things that Larry Page had done when he was the CEO of Google, and that was to completely compartmentalize the search and ad teams. So they worked totally independently of each other and had no knowledge of how the other functioned. And that was intentional, as Larry had not wanted the ad team to increase ad revenue by cheating and using the code to hack engagement. At the time, Prabhakar Raghavan was the head of Yahoo Search. While Google focused on the user experience, Raghavan at Yahoo wanted to drive revenue up. If you used Yahoo back in the early 2000s, you'll remember it was about as much fun as using a power sander to shave your balls. It was basically an ad page, which did its best to send you to another ad page, which was loosely related to what you searched for. Google just sent you to the answer. It's why everybody loved it. When Raghavan came to Yahoo, their market share was 30%. Google was 36% at the time. When Raghavan left Yahoo in 2012, that market share had dipped to just 13%. Even Bing had a larger market share than Yahoo. In fact, Yahoo search was so poor, they eventually just licensed Bing instead. Imagine being the guy who got beat by Bing so badly, he then had to hire Bing to do his job for him. It's hard to stress just how bad at his job this guy was. So on the strength of that, obviously Google hired him for some reason. Between 2014 and 2019, Larry Page and Sergey Brin had been slowly pulling back from executive life and work. There's a few different reasons why, but most of it seems to stem from increased scrutiny over the recent union-busting practices at Google after they fired 4 employees who tried to organize a union. And repeated claims of sexual harassment against a few executives, not Larry and Sergey themselves. But those executives had all been fired for sexual harassment, but were given $1 million payouts when they left. Something which Google didn't need to do, as being fired for cause would invalidate the bonus clauses of their contracts anyway. They voluntarily paid them millions of dollars. So, Larry and Sergey decided to step down, and the man that they'd been grooming to take over was a guy called Sundar Pichai. Sorry if I'm butchering the names, I don't speak Hindi. Despite an 8% decline in revenue in 2016, when Larry and Sergey were still calling the shots, Google didn't make any staff cuts. But as Pichai started to gain more influence, he immediately announced to their 186,000 staff members in 2018 that 12,000 of them no longer had a job. Google also removed the "Don't be evil" slogan from their pages at the same time. Throughout this whole time, our friend Ben Gomez, had been complaining about the repeated encroachment of the ad team, headed by Raghavan. Gomez sent an email in which he had talked about how the search team were being pressured into compromising search function to increase ad revenue, something which he resisted. He listed the ways in which you could use engagement hacking to increase ad revenue to demonstrate how bad it was, and to say that it would ruin the experience for the user in addition to being highly unethical. Things like turning off the spell checker, removing or disabling ad labels, or just flat out intentionally sending someone to the wrong page so they have to search again. And this would increase the amount of times a user would accidentally land on the wrong page or have the wrong answer returned, which would make you type the search again and see a whole new set of ads. boosting ad revenue. Obviously, this was some kind of light bulb moment for Raghavan and Pichai, as shortly after, Ben Gomez left his position as head of search, and Raghavan, the guy who literally destroyed Yahoo search, was promoted by Pichai to head of search. Since then, search has got worse and worse with every Google update. You might wonder why Sundar Pichai might favour job cuts and shady practices as a method of quickly increasing stock value. But it's probably not a surprise at this point to learn his previous employer was McKinsey. The tech bro blow up in Silicon Valley has actually been a massive boon for McKinsey, as they now have their consultants in many different tech pies. They have consultants at SpaceX, Tesla, Google, Yahoo, more Google, Microsoft, Enron, DoorDash, Jack Herrick, the founder of WikiHow. They're seriously everywhere. Even the fucking owner of Lego is a former McKinsey rep. And this is only the list of McKinsey reps in high positions in tech. If we widen the net to include all business, the list is massive. And if we include politics as well, it starts to get scary. Since we're on the topic, let's talk about the ubiquitousness, is that a word? Of McKinsey consultants in very sensitive positions. In their book, When McKinsey Comes to Town, Michael Forsyth and Walt Bogdanovich tell a story about how an older McKinsey rep had given a new recruit some very telling advice. He told the recruit, wedge yourself in and spread like an amoeba. You should spread yourself in the organization and do everything like a Trojan horse. Here's some data on McKinsey reps in prominent government positions. Keep in mind that this is just the reps in prominent positions. There will be many, 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 many more in less prominent positions. Some have served in left-leaning governments, some have served in right-leaning governments. McKinsey is also a big donator to political parties. Which one, you ask? All. They donated to Obama, they donated to Trump, they donated to everyone. Just in the USA, they have reps in both Republican and Democrat administrations at both state and federal level. Outside the USA, they've reached as high as Prime Minister and political party leaders. And if Pete Buttigieg, I don't know how you say his name actually, is it Buttigieg? Buttigieg? If Pete gets nominated for Democrats at the next election, they'll have the very first McKinsey Democratic candidate. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not claiming that all of McKinsey are like some secret Hydra operatives with some sort of secret political agenda. Their agenda is pretty public and obvious. Money. They want to make as much money as possible, and they don't care what they wreck in the process, because then they'll just pitch themselves as the best people to clean up for whatever it is that they wreck. They often get their foot in the door by offering to do work pro bono, and then once they're in, they spread like an amoeba until they get themselves hired for fees. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing of all, is they often advise and help governments who are directly in opposition to your own. Over the years, McKinsey has begun its amoeba-like spread throughout various dictatorial and repressive governments of the world. For example, they have represented the interests of Russian oil on numerous occasions, even as they were sanctioned, which is illegal. McKinsey also has an office in China. And China has about 90 state-managed companies, which sort of look like private companies if you squint, but actually are totally controlled by the Chinese central government. According to When McKinsey Comes to Town, McKinsey has advised 26 of those state-owned companies. We don't know exactly what McKinsey advised them on, because neither McKinsey nor the CCP will ever reveal that. A public statement was once made that China Communications Construction Company, one of said state-controlled businesses, was very proud to hire McKinsey to analyze market environments and help them achieve their overall strategic goals. What were those goals? Well, in 2014, China Communications were planning to send a fleet of ships to basically suck up the ocean bottom and then dump it somewhere else. Now, if you know anything about the South China Seas, you know it's a massive shipping lane and is also of huge importance from a military standpoint too. The USA has policed this area of the ocean for a long time to prevent China's expansion into territories friendly to the USA, like the Philippines. There is also a lot of oil reserves in the shallows of these areas, which every country wants to control. Now, you would imagine that the correct way to split the area would be the seas closest to Vietnam or Vietnamese, the closest to China or Chinese, closest to Philippines or Filipino, and the closest to Brunei or Brunese. The problem? Well, the seas closest to China are a bit shit and don't contain much oil. This stretch, in between the Philippines and Vietnam, seems to be the richest. But obviously, China can't just control seas it doesn't even border, right? Wrong. They can simply make artificial islands in the area, and then technically they do border that ocean and can claim it as Chinese territory, and aggressively police it with military force. And they do that by sucking up the ocean floor and dumping it into the ocean, creating new islands, which is exactly what's been happening for the last, decade or so. And the whole time they were doing this, McKinsey was on their payroll, advising them on how to execute this project. They were also contracted by the US Department of Defense for the F-35 fighter program too, at the same time. Now, some might say that McKinsey are just doing a commission job and they had little to no connection to the Chinese government's aims. But when you consider that the then Prime Minister's son was a McKinsey consultant and now works as the Director General of China's central bank, it's a little harder to argue against that idea. McKinsey were also paid consultants on Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, a program designed to increase China's influence around the world by lending poor countries money that they couldn't afford to pay. The money would be used to build roads and train services which China would then control when the debtor couldn't afford to pay. Hopefully, I don't need to point out just how much of a risk and how unethical it is for McKinsey to be advising two sides of the same economic conflict. This isn't the only example of McKinsey advising against its own country's interests, but it is an easy one to see and comprehend. Remember, most of their work is done in shadow, so we don't even know what they advise or to whom most of the time. But what we do know is they have little to no interest in helping Americans if it's at cost to themselves. In February of 2016, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia died, and he left his son Mohammed bin Salman in charge of the kingdom, a man who a few years earlier had convinced the judge to sign off on a business deal by placing a bullet on the table and telling him that he had no choice but to sign. Prior to his death, the king had slowly been rolling back some of the more repressive and Western unfriendly laws as a method of opening up the country and making it more attractive to foreign investment. In fact, since the mid-90s or so, McKinsey had an office in Riyadh and had been the company advising the king to do this. But while the Western world welcomed these changes, and actually many of the Saudis did too, MBS did not. He saw it as a violation of his culture in much the same way that Osama bin Laden did. To get closer to the royal family in Saudi Arabia, McKinsey had been employing various relatives of the royal family for decades, usually ones which were related to the managers of Aramco. 1 year later, in 2017, McKinsey made their first acquisition in almost 100 years. The purchase of another Saudi-based consulting company, owned and run by a former McKinsey rep. The owner was a man called Hani Koja. Hani was very close to government ministers and had also won some government contracts. Buying the company made McKinsey closer to the government. A few months later, Koja was detained by the Saudi government for 14 months and repeatedly beaten. He was one of 350 people who were all detained and accused of corruption and forced to sign over all their assets to the Saudi state. It was a taster of what was to come. By the late 2000s, Arabic nations began experiencing demonstrations from their people. They were demanding change from the older repressive and anti-democratic systems and regimes. In some places, this toppled governments and removed authoritarian autocrats from power. This was the main driving factor behind King Abdullah's social reforms in the hope that the same upheaval didn't happen in Saudi Arabia. When MBS took over, he had a very different, much more hardline approach. The people weren't going to get democracy. In 2016, MBS hired McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and Cambridge Analytica to perform social media monitoring of civilian public profiles. The tool was originally developed to help companies target ads better based on the keywords that people were using in their posts. So, if you posted about being thirsty on Twitter, they sent you ads for Coca-Cola. That's how the system worked. Bin Salman quickly realized that the same tool could be used to track people who were speaking out against his rules. Saudi Arabian YouTuber Omar Abdulaziz was one of the people targeted by McKinsey as being a negative influence on Saudi Arabian feelings about MBS rule. Abdulaziz lived in Montreal and was asked by the Saudi government to return to Saudi. He very wisely declined. So, they threw 2 of his brothers in jail to convince him to come back, and he still declined. Then, they hacked his phone and found messages between him and a Washington Post journalist named Jamal Kasogghi.
Saudi officials are now confirming Washington Post contributor Jamal Kasogghi is dead. They say the journalist died after a fight in the Saudi consulate in Turkey.
In their communication, they had talked of creating an anti-propaganda network to counter what MBS had been doing online. Since MBS had been paying bot farms to make pro-Saudi posts, they were going to do the opposite and find a bot farm to make anti-Saudi posts. A few weeks later, in October of 2018, Kasogghi was murdered while collecting marriage paperwork at the Saudi consulate in Turkey. American intelligence stated that he was murdered at the behest of MBS and his body was decapitated with a buzzsaw. His wife waited outside the consulate for a husband that would never return. Abdulaziz twice tried to sue McKinsey for making him a target. The first time, McKinsey had the case dismissed on the grounds that the courts didn't have jurisdiction, wasn't in Montreal. The second time it was dismissed as the statute of limitations had expired. In neither occasion did McKinsey deny what they did. In March 2019, CEO Kevin Sneeder was asked by CNBC what McKinsey would do if they found out that their client was a murderer. He said this.
Hard about the work that we do. It needs to be work that does make a positive difference. Sure. And that's what I'm focused on.
Doing business with a murderer is okay by you?
No, it's absolutely not.
Okay, and when you find out that your client is a murderer, you do what?
You walk.
You walk.
Except McKinsey stayed in Saudi Arabia working for MBS. I guess McKinsey's motto is really true. They really don't focus on policy. They're experts in execution. You might wonder, after all this discussion, why the hell anyone would continue to hire a company which often causes both reputational and actual damage to the people who hire them and their communities. And this isn't even exhaustive. I didn't even talk about how they present themselves as a green company whilst also advising every fossil fuel company on how to increase the use of fossil fuels. I didn't talk about how they've helped the health and motor insurance companies deny valid claims and push thousands of people into medical debt slavery. The delay, deny, defend phrase that you keep hearing in the media is from this book and was paraphrased on the bullets which killed healthcare CEO Brian Thompson by Luigi Mangione. That delay, deny, defend advice was given to healthcare companies by McKinsey. So why? It's pretty simple really, and I've kind of mentioned it already. McKinsey and others like it exist purely to allow CEOs and companies to do something bad, but take no criticism for it. They want to cut staff, they want to take shortcuts, and they want to do things which bring in big profit, but also cause massive problems. So, they hire McKinsey to come in and tell the company or CEO exactly what they want to hear. If a CEO thinks that he should cut staff to boost his bonuses, then they hire McKinsey to come in and say, hey, you really need to cut staff, and then your bonuses are going to get boosted. That way they can simply say, oh, this wasn't our decision. This was a tough action made on the recommendation of a world-renowned consulting company. They absolve themselves. At the same time, they can say anything bad that happens wasn't their fault. They were just following professional advice. It serves the same purpose for McKinsey too. They earn money giving advice, they earn money cleaning up the mistake that advice has just caused, and they too get to say, hey, we were just doing what the client asked us to do. Essentially, McKinsey serves as like a real-life business personification of the pointing Spider-Man meme. They allow evil people to make evil decisions without feeling like it was even their decision in the first place, and thus not their responsibility. Every single story I've told today could have been avoided by McKinsey simply advising the clients not to do the thing that they wanted to do. If McKinsey didn't create these evil situations, though I would argue that they did, they certainly enabled it. The McKinsey way is a common industry phrase now, which supposedly signifies an efficient and profit-boosting management method. The McKinsey way in reality is to get paid to fuck things up, get paid to clean up the things you just fucked up, and make sure nobody knows you were the ones who fucked it all up.
If you want to protect your data and access geo-locked streaming content, then please don't forget to download and install PIAVPN using the link in the description box below and get yourself a great deal.